Mouser Electronics is an authorized semiconductor and electronic component distributor focused on new product introductions from its leading manufacturer partners. Serving the global electronic design engineer and buyer community, its website features more than 5 million products from over 1,200 manufacturer brands. For more information, visit Mouser.com. So on this episode of the EEDI Podcast, we're going to talk about the realities of electric vehicles, right? Brian, electric vehicles are super trendy, right?
They are really cool when you think about it. They are really cool, but a lot of times, a lot harder to implement, right? A lot harder to implement than we actually think, especially from an infrastructure point of view,
Right. And we've got governments making laws, right? These consumers are out there eager to buy. Private companies are investing in all this. But what about the actual usability and potential of actual widespread adoption? I mean, GM wants to stop selling gas and diesel vehicles by 2035. In Europe, Honda's only selling EVs and hybrids after this year, I think. And in just 8 years, BMW is predicting that over half of its global sales will be battery cars. Oh, and Bentley. Let's not forget Bentley. Bentley saying goodbye to tailpipes in 2030, right? And that's just a few examples, so we can push.
It seems like the magic number is like 2030, right? So roughly 8 years from now, right? 2030 to 2035, and I think it depends on where the company is located to where they're pushing, right? You see like a lot of the ones outside the United States actually pushing harder than, the United States. It seems like you said, like GM's 2035. You see a lot, later, but it's going to be interesting for everyone to implement this infrastructure where it becomes totally usable.
Right. I mean, let's go back to your infrastructure statement, right? The government can push all the electric vehicles. The companies can say, we're going electric, right? We can do this all day till our faces turn blue. But if there's no charging infrastructure or at least efficient charging infrastructure in place, and it doesn't actually become easier to adopt into the home, right? Then what's the point?
Yeah, I mean, you got to think about it, right? Most houses, especially like if you look in certain areas of, I'm just going to use the United States because that's really my frame of reference, right? I don't really, know too much about what's going on in infrastructure outside the United States. But if you think about it, especially in the older areas of the country, like, we're in New York, right? It's older infrastructure. Most people don't have 400, volts coming into their house. Like they just don't, it's not, it doesn't work that way, right? Where they could output for a 400 volt and charge this car in 2 hours or whatever the case is. They don't have the infrastructure, so many changes have to be done to the grid. I mean, where you see new places being built in the United States, because we do have a lot of still unused land and rural land, and even in some suburban areas where you see new developments going in, yes, you could put that infrastructure in play, right? All their power's underground versus, in the Northeast. That's why every time we have a storm, everyone's out of power because, something goes down and boom, we're out of power, So there are just so many factors, in this that it becomes super, super hard to implement the infrastructure in order for it to be easy. I mean, think about like smart devices, right? Let's just use that as an example. Even that is complicated, and we don't need a whole lot of power to run those because sometimes they don't talk to each other. Now imagine like having to run, here, even personally, like, in my house, I have to do like upgraded work to even get an outlet to where like the EV would be charged, right? So there's a lot of things that have to happen for this to work. And I know there are a lot of initiatives going on, even with some of the car companies. I think Chevy like offers like, some sort of free installation. There's all these rebates and things like that going on. But even so, these are not really simple things for a user to implement. Most people aren't going home and plugging it in. That's just the reality of it.
My sister just got a hybrid Jeep up in Boston, and her and my mom went to brunch, and right in the parking lot, she charged the vehicle while they were out to brunch. And that's great. I mean, I see the charging stations even here at Stop and Shop, I mean, I never see anybody using them, right? But I see them, right? I see them all the time. Right. And I do want to talk a little bit about the actual usability of them. And I want to talk about a specific study I came across. But, before we even kind of look at what needs to be done, I'd like to kind of stop and look at what the government is pushing. Like, what are
Mhm.
what is the government saying? What are they trying to implement? What's really happening around us to transition the country away from fossil fuels?
Right.
I know there are a lot of our current administration has been pushing for that shift since before they even took office, right? I
Mhm.
mean, that's a big bullet point for them.
Right.
But there were some executive orders done
Mhm.
early on. I mean, I
And there's
think even
a
they
lot of
wanted
bills, for it, right?
a
And job
lot.
acts that have
Yeah.
been created around, the infrastructure.
Even the post office, the U.S. Post Office is supposed to be all electric, though I did read that they're not actually going all electric.
Well,
And
I mean, let's talk about it. Okay, so let's talk about the post office for a second, right? The post office has been on the cusp of collapse for years. For years, right? They've been talking about this, going bankrupt because it's run outside of the government, right? It's run as an independent. How can they replace all their vehicles in one fell swoop? It's just, and I hope they can because I love the post office, right? You know what I mean? I'm a fan,
I love the
but
post office. I've never
but
heard anyone say that,
yeah,
Brian.
but I mean, I love what they do. Do you know what I mean? Like the thought of what they are, what they've done for countries all around the world, right? Being able to communicate, you got to think about
Mhm,
this. This was a form of communication before we were all emailing each other, right?
mhm,
What they did for our communication and people staying in touch. Like, I love the concept of what it was, which I know, the internet has now replaced so much of that, but you get my point. Like, the concept of what it was to, be able to connect people.
mhm.
So that's why I say I love it. It's like the concept. But how can you expect this, this entity who's had financial problems to all of a sudden go and replace all their vehicles unless it's being paid for by the
Well, I
federal
mean, and
government?
and there are some monies being dedicated to that. I mean, that's part of the executive order too, that
Mhm.
that was originally signed in early on in this administration. So, I mean, yes, there's money being spent. And you brought up the Jobs Act, right?
Yeah.
I have something here I wanted to read. Um, so let's see. The Jobs Act actually allocates $7.5 billion specifically for the EV infrastructure programs and grants on a national level. And out of that, 2.5 billion is to be used for charging and refueling infrastructure grants.
Mhm.
And then the remaining five is for the National Electric Vehicle Charging Program. So I mean, there's money going to
Yeah.
things,
Mhm.
but what's the problem? What's happening?
Well, I mean, what I would ask myself is this, right? And you see this in places like certain places, certain states, you could buy green energy, right? And how do you really know it's green? Because it all goes together, gets mixed up. I know we've talked about this before with other guests.
Mhm.
But what's really interesting is even if you're charging your vehicle electric, and I understand it still helps the environment because less emissions, less things like that going out. But the reality is you may still be using brown energy, fossil
Right.
fuels to actually power the electric vehicle.
Mhm.
So in essence, you're still, engaging in something you don't want you may not want to do. Like if you're really into anti-fossil fuels, then it gets it. I don't understand if that's the purpose because chances are if you're in an area like ours, you're using I mean houses are still run by gas, we have gas heat, we have, what I mean? We have fossil fuels. We're not all, there's no green energy where there may be green energy, but there's not always green energy coming into your house or fully
Mhm.
green energy.
Right.
And most people aren't going to build a solar array big enough to power the battery that's going to charge their electric car, So it
No? You
gets
don't have time for
interesting.
that? You don't wanna do that?
Well, I mean, I would do it, but also there's expense there, right? Run the electric out to your, you know, um, whatever, your driveway or whatever, or convert your whole house to solar. There's a
Mhm.
big expense difference, right? For
Yeah.
people.
And there are some, and there's some rebates that are happening. I mean,
Yeah.
think about in New York, right? The governor here, she signed a bill that mandated zero emissions cars by 2035. And so she's put into effect all these initiatives, right? The Charge New
Mhm.
York initiative. And so electric car buyers, get $2,000 for new car purchases, or, there's federal tax credits up to whatever, $7,000, $8,000.
Right.
So like there's a lot of money being given, but my question really goes back to, like, are we giving the money to the right people, right? There are federal loans and funding for R&D, obviously, but
Right.
what we talk about, and when we talk to companies, we're talking to the actual, companies that are, the brains behind this. I mean, we're, like
Yes.
that's what we're talking about. And so are they, do they have what they need to kind of do what it takes? Does that
Well,
make sense?
and I think that's a really good point, right? Because the companies who are building this technology, the companies that are, engrossed in developing the actual tech, making the components, right?
Mhm.
Probably know a little bit more about this than, some,
Yeah.
let's just be honest, the governments,
Right.
and really what's going on with the industry and where things are too, especially, we talk about this all the time, especially with all the shortages going on.
Mhm. Yeah. And even, when we talk about feasibility of making making us all electric, right? Transitioning us to an all electric world in the vehicle space. You know, we talk about the charging, but there are different types of charging, right? And so, like, are
Yeah.
we set up for these things? And
Yep.
when we were talking to the folks over at Sager and T Connectivity recently, we were talking about those differences between AC and DC charging, and
Yeah.
why, like, where is one suitable? I don't even think consumers really understand this. When
I don't
they
even.
go
Yeah.
and they buy, they don't
Yeah,
care. They
I
don't
don't even
know.
think they forget about buying a car. I don't even think a lot of consumers even understand it in their home.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like in their
Right.
home, much less in a car, right? So they don't even understand where they're using AC and DC, in
Right.
certain
Right.
places, in their regular daily life, because it's become so easy.
Right.
And that's the reality of even the way these vehicles need to be, or the infrastructure needs to be. It needs to be as easy as it is, because that's how you're going to get the consumer adoption.
I want to cut to this clip because I think the folks over at T did a great job at explaining the difference and how it affects, the user when it comes to AC and DC charging for electric vehicles. So I want to cut to this real quick.
Let's go through the differences in level 1, level 2, and level 3, right? So as I was discussing, level 1, the application plugs into the wall, into any wall. Voltage is going to be 120 volts AC. Amperage is going to, we're talking about 16 amps. And in terms of power, we're using like 1.9 kilowatts approximately. Now, level 2 is going to be a little bit higher, right? So it's more of a charging station into your garage, something like that.
Mhm.
And it's going to be 240 volts AC. Now, in terms of amperage, it's going to 80 amps. In power, now we're using 19.2 kilowatts. And now the level 3 or DC fast charging, right? Now this is one of the biggest charging piles that are going to be replacing gas pumps in the near future. And in terms of voltage, we're going from 300 volts to 1000 volts DC. In terms of amperage, we're going between 50 to 500 amps. And in terms of power, between 50 and 500 kilowatts. So as you can see, that what makes the difference in terms of the charging, right? The more power, the more amperage we're delivering, the faster we can charge the car. And that's why one of the main concerns that we were discussing a little bit earlier, it has to do with thermal management, right? So the more power, the higher the temperature, and we need our components to withstand those high temperatures.
Okay, so they talk about seeing more DC fast charging stations across the country, and I think it's worth mentioning a recent study out of Berkeley,
Mhm.
because everybody kind of, like, we talk about this, but like they actually studied 657. What was it? Oh, gosh, it was like 181 public charging stations,
Mhm.
657 vehicles, whatever it was. I mean, basically the gist is, and we'll put the link in the description so you can read it yourself. But basically, like, a lot of them didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too. I don't know exactly when this study's from, but it's funny because you mentioned earlier, about like pulling up at the mall. It's funny too because you look at where like there's one mall near me and the charging stations are all in one back corner. Like they're far away from the entrance. And you barely ever see a car being charged there. Then there's another mall we go to and they're like almost like where the handicap spots would be, right? They're right at the entryway. Those are always parked in with an EV charging because guess what? People don't want to walk. People are lazy. People are just generally lazy
I'll charge
creatures.
my card just so I don't have to walk.
I just want this close spot that I could get versus having to park my car and walk and maybe not just do something good for the environment, but myself. They're like so self-centered on like, oh, look, it's a close spot. And I mean, but that is a good tactic to get them to use it, right? Make it like it's the same distance as a handicap spot so you don't have to walk that far. People seem to be using it, whereas the ones that are further away, always empty. And, it's so crazy funny too, because like you said, a lot of times, these things are down. They're down.
Right. So down. So here, I found specifically what they had discovered was that not only were they non-functional, right? They said about 5% of the charger's cords were too short to reach the car. Okay. Then there were broken connectors, there were network failures, there were payment processing failures, the screens were unresponsive. And then what they did was they came back to 10% of those like 8 days later or something, and they still weren't fixed.
Well, let's talk about infrastructure, right? I mean, any infrastructure requires consistent repair.
Right.
Like think about a roadway. There's always road work being done, especially in high traffic areas. We live in New York, around the city. It's very congested. There is always some sort of construction or change going on. Think about an EV charger. It's no different. Like it's no different than electrical. If it's being used by multiple people, some people are going to just jam that charger in there. Other people are going to treat it like it's their own. People are going to get mad and, I don't know, kick the machine. Who knows what people are doing? But if there's not like, someone maintaining these things, you're going to find a lot of failure. You're going to find just electronic failures, things fail,
Yeah.
So if they're not maintained, what's interesting is because, I hope as a society, we're not approaching this as, okay, let's just build it and then we're done, because that's crazy. Because if we think about any infrastructure piece we have, there's always constant maintenance going on, like 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, maintenance going on any piece of infrastructure.
Yep. And, those aren't the only like technical barriers, right? That limit really the adoption of EVs right now, right?
But from a consumer perspective, that's probably the biggest one, right?
I mean, but let's think about like the technical barriers. You've also got like, it's not just technical barriers, but for example, you get the cost of producing the batteries, right? That make these things work.
Yeah, we got the cost of producing the batteries, but you also have what's being done to the environment to produce the batteries, right? So there has to be, and I'm no expert on this, like and I don't even pretend, but I don't know the difference between like pulling out fossil fuels and what it takes to mine lithium,
right?
And create these batteries. Like, is one worse than the other? I don't know. Feel free to comment and let me know that I'm an idiot and one is. You know what I mean? Right? Like, but my point is, like, and eventually I got it. Like, if I eventually mine the lithium, but I don't even know how much lithium there is. Like. Is there enough for everyone?
Does anyone know that? If anybody knows how much lithium is out there, can you let us know?
How much lithium is there on the planet? Or that we need to start mining meteorites to get more lithium? Like, I have no clue, right? Like, is there enough for everyone? Because think about lithium's in every device we're using, every battery we use. And maybe there is like, and like I said, I'm no expert. Maybe lithium could be recycled and reused. I don't know. Right.
Well, we need a smart engineer to please let us know. If you know the answer, please tell us.
But, so there is issues with, the lithium, it takes a lot to produce it, and I think, I mean, you hear people talk about the limited range of the vehicles. And there's part of that I agree with and part of that I disagree with, right? I mean, you go the same distance now as a tank of gas. So the problem is is the infrastructure going to be there when you run out of that power in order to refill? And is it going to take you 8 hours to refill your car?
Right.
Repower up your car? Is it going to take 2 hours, maybe like at the, those mall charging stations?
Mhm.
Or is it going to take, it's one of those rapid charging stations where it's running at whatever it is, 1,000 volts or whatever it is. So you can charge your car in 30 minutes, or 15 minutes. So what are you going to get at the other end of your destination, right? And think about it. If you're traveling through rural America, you're doing a cross-country trip, you're going to need to stop in some places that you may not be able to find the power level you want, right? You may not be able to find the power level you want in order to charge your vehicle.
Right.
Or even maintenance for the vehicle. Let's be honest. Like if something goes wrong with that vehicle, how many places are repairing electric vehicles, right? You don't have an engine, you see what I'm saying? Like if there's electronics failure going on, it's much different than if you need a new spark plug.
Right. And how does that change the job of a mechanic? I mean, think about that. I never thought of that until you just said that. But like, it's almost like the mechanic of the future has a very different skill set almost.
Yeah. Well, I mean, did you ever see that guy? I know we've talked about him before. The guy that like bought the wrecked Tesla and was trying to get parts from Tesla and he couldn't get parts. So he had to buy like other wrecked Teslas to fix the Tesla, and grab the parts. So even some of the parts, and this was early on, early on, this was probably, I don't even know how long ago this was. This guy was making he had some really cool YouTube videos, and if we find the links, we'll add them in here. But basically, he had to like salvage other wrecked Teslas in order to get parts for his Tesla to fix it. So it was a pretty cool, like sort of like documentary type series. But to your point, like it may not be a mechanic. It may wind up being like some engineer type, position that winds up helping you fix the car, diagnose the car.
Right. Right. Very different. So that's something to think about. But, we also did talk about the AC/DC, the difference between the charging times and whatnot. But, those are still some barriers there, right? We're still dealing with that. And,
think about it. Think about it. If it takes you let's just talk about this, right? Because I talked, my son keeps saying he wants to get, an electric vehicle. And I'm like, okay, if you had to charge it at our house, it'd probably take you 12 hours, right? And the closest thing is the mall. And those are like sort of that mid-range. I think they're like 400 volt. And that would probably take you about 2 hours, and don't get me wrong. He's like, well, I would just sit at the mall for 2 hours. Really? You're going to spend 2 hours of your life sitting at the mall to charge
What happens when you're married with kids, dude? I don't know if you have time for that.
Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. There's probably other charging stations around. You get my point. And maybe you could drive to the highway to find one of the fast charging stations at like one of the road stops. But my point is this: what if your battery is really low and you leave it for a couple of days? You forget, like all of us, we leave our car with a little bit of gas. We're going to be in a hurry. Life is life, and you get busy, and maybe you don't drive your EV for 2 or 3 days. And now you have no power when you turn on, or you run out of power completely. Right. What are you going to do? Pull out a gas generator, start it up? You know what I'm saying? And like power your car with a gas generator, or plug it in and now have to wait 8 hours for it to be fully charged, or wait even 2 hours to have enough charge, let's say, to even drive to the other one where you can charge it quicker and it still takes you another hour and a half. So some of it, like if you don't have the infrastructure at your disposal, right? Like we have gas stations everywhere, right? If you don't have those charging stations everywhere,
right? Location, that's important. Yeah.
Right. If you don't have something at home, it can become really complicated. I mean, I'm sure everyone's seen this video of the guy that pulls up on the guy in the Tesla, and the guy ran out of power, and the guy's like, hey, you need help? He's like, no, I got it. And in his trunk of the Tesla, he has a small Honda gas generator and a tank of gas. I don't know if it was fake or real, but it's a really funny video. And he's basically charging his Tesla with a gas-based generator. I mean, no one needs a key now. All of a sudden, have electric vehicles toting around, 5 gallons of gas and a small generator to, make it work. Like that's not feasible, for whatever the whole population. Like think about it.
Even the cost of the vehicle itself for the end user. I mean, my uncle, he's a general sales manager with what is it, GM or Chevy, or they're the same, one and the same, right? And so I was arguing that, the costs, and he's like, wouldn't you say today, his argument is that, with the price of gas, you're even going to talk to me about, the little the little increase in cost that you're getting on, you know what I mean, for an electric vehicle, and you get rebates and stuff like that too, right? So I mean, it may actually make sense, it
Yeah.
really does. Like, for example, the Nissan Leaf,
Mhm.
it's about $7,000 more than a Toyota Camry. So I mean, yeah, it's a little bit more, but is it really? I mean, when you take everything into account,
Well,
and
here's my question though. So we got these rebates, we
mhm,
got these things, and maybe that helps you pay for the infrastructure or the changes that go on in your
mhm.
home, right? But here's my question also. Does What does your electric bill look like if you're
Ooh.
charging at your house, or what does the electric bill look like for the country if you're charging at public stations that are free?
Okay, so what you really need to do is have your house go solar, right? So that you're not
That's my point.
right
If you're
first, and then do it, right?
Yep. Yeah.
That's
So
kind of
because
the
here's the
order of
thing,
operation.
you're still using power. Chances
Mhm.
are right now you're still going to be
Right.
using brown energy. You're going to
Mhm.
be using fossil fuels, whatever the case is.
Right. So, I mean, what about the future of electric vehicle charging? I don't know if we want to maybe just kind of let the users know about the different levels, which I
Yeah,
know it seems
absolutely.
silly. It seems silly because, like, do we really need to know? But I think it's really important as we're adopting this technology for everyone to really understand the different types of charging.
Mhm.
So, I mean, maybe we want to cut to this clip from TE as well, where they really broke down, levels 1, 2, and 3 for us.
So AC is going to be more like again plug and play, right? So more into residential. Anyone's probably going to have one of these on their houses, and more like commercial destination work kind of style, right? So right now, if you go to the grocery or something, you're going to see those piles there. Those are going to be AC level 2, and everything back in your house might be level 1, level 2. But now, if you're taking like a road trip, right, and you need faster charging, then you have to go through one of these DC fast charging piles. Right? Why? Because you don't want to stay there for 10, 12 hours charging your car, right? You want to be there 20, 30 minutes and then continue with your trip. So again, right now, DC fast charging stations are delivering about 80% between 20 and 30 minutes charging time.
So it seems like DC is going to obviously replace regular gas stations, where AC is going to be mostly home use. Is that what
That
we're predicting?
Yeah, that's somehow accurate, right? So AC is going to be home, work, and destination, versus DC is going to be more in terms of the EV infrastructure moving forward. So with all the incentives from different governments and with the projections towards 2040, right, of having at least half of the vehicles in North America being EV,
Mhm.
then that's where we're going to start seeing more DC fast charging stations a lot across the country. Certainly, personally, I believe that electrification is the future of the world. So, in terms of electrification, again, in order to achieve an electrified world, it's going to be based on, again, thermal management, and those thermal management supporting higher loads, current, and voltage. So if design engineers, component engineers find a way to mix that higher loads with lowering the temperature, as I was talking right now about liquid cooling, then that's where we're going to see the future of EV charging, right? So eventually going into a charging station, one of these infrastructures replacing regular gas stations, and hopefully getting to just plug your car, couple of minutes, and then continue with your road, with your trip.
All right. So now that we're educated there, I was mentioning the future. Like, now we know what needs to be done. These companies are doing what they need to do. So Hopefully. So what's the future look like? What do you think the future looks like, Brian?
I think eventually we will get there, and I think it's a good thing that we will get there. I think we need to work on the infrastructure as a whole to get the infrastructure off the brown energy, right? Before you could start really implementing these things. That's me, because you still need the brown energy to power the greener energy, if that makes sense, right? I think that's the future, but I think the most important thing, in my opinion, is, well, even though government is making decisions and some of the car manufacturers are making decisions, I really think they need to have better conversations with the people in the electronics component industry, because I think those companies have a lot different insight that can be super helpful to the governments, to the car manufacturers, to all the other people involved that are going to actually help it propel, help it happen faster, help make those timelines of the 2030s and 2035s for us.
All right. And if you're an engineer, here's some insight into what you should be thinking about in order to achieve an electrified world.